So an international standardised benchmarking survey that was conducted last year has revealed that South Africa's grade 5 school students are ranked last out of 59 countries in mathematics and science. Meanwhile, the grade 9 learners' maths performance has shown some improvement. For more on this, we are now joined by the Director of National Assessment at the Department of Basic Education, Dr. Mark Chetty. Dr. Chetty, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. What's your overall assessment of these two assessments and the reports that were released yesterday and what it tells us about basic education?
Good morning, Aldrin, and good morning to your viewers. Well, I think the first thing that we want to put out that yesterday was a very unique opportunity for the Department of Basic Education. It was the international release date of TIMS, which is a Trends in International and Mathematics Study, but we probably are the only country that released not only the international study, but also a regional study, which we participate with other Southern and East African countries called SACMEC, and we released our first baseline South African systemic evaluation. So we had 3 composite and one would say complementary data sets in which we could release to the public in order to get a better sense of how the education system is, where our learners are performing. So taking those 3 studies into context, we get some common trends and we get a sense of where our learners are performing well and where there are challenges. So in short, we have high school learners and we have primary school learners participating in these tests. At the high school level, especially at the grade 9, it seems to be stable towards improving. At the primary school, we see that there is a challenge. It's more constrained in foundational literacy and numeracy, and that's where we need to focus our targeted interventions and support.
Yeah, and let's look at the TIMS study. When it comes to the grade 5 pupils, as we've just indicated now in the introduction as well, South Africa's grade 5 pupils being ranked last out of the 59 participating countries in this particular study. Do we know where the fault lines are, though?
Well, last is a relative term as well. I want to say it's 56 countries. There are some few benchmark countries that participate as provinces, one would say. So it's not entire countries. So it's not why we participate. It's not a competition with other countries, but it does point us to relative benchmarking. So we want to look at how our learners are performing in relation to what is a 400-point threshold, where we see our grade 5 learners are still some distance away, which means there is a constraint on basic and fundamental mathematics concepts that are tested in the international assessments. So we need to look at some of the underlying factors that are leading to these results in these earlier grades. And one of the big factors that comes across that's different to other countries, and that's why it's a little bit meaningless to compare ourselves to other countries, because we have unique contexts. Our language, we're the only country that have 11 official languages from the participating countries. So the language, and last year we released our PEARLS results, which showed that there was an issue with reading literacy. So when we interpret the mathematics results, we have to bear in mind what are the other issues? Is the reading literacy also playing a role in interfering with the mathematics? Before we can even talk about basic mathematics, we've got to look at whether children are accessing these questions at the level at which they need to. And we see that language is proving to be a barrier.
Language is proving to be a barrier, but for the students that come from households where the home language is the same language of the medium of instruction, the results are showing that actually their results are much better compared to children whose house setup is a bit different in terms of the language that is being used. But even then, comparatively, are we performing well compared to the other countries?
Well, if you look at the Afrikaans group of learners, which are scoring around 420 in both mathematics and science, so that will tell us that there is a strong sense of performance where the home language matches the language of the test. The majority of learners that are taking these tests the match is not exact. So you have learners who are coming from homes where their language is not the same. So there is significant differences that we need to focus on. But to answer your question, yes, across the system, in the early years of schooling, we need to do more. We need to do more in foundational literacy and foundational numeracy, so that even where the language of the learners are the same, we can see more marked improvement in them.
And maybe bringing in the early childhood development phase into basic education will try and address some of these issues. Because I was looking at how some of the participants, especially from the Asian countries, and you look at a Singapore, how come Singapore is performing so well? And my colleague earlier on was saying, Andy was saying that because in Singapore they start very early, with some of the foundational teachings, and for instance, starting with the words and the numeracy and so forth. What is our problem then?
Yeah, so exactly. It's amazing that all the Eastern countries, you know, dominate the top positions. So looking at Hong Kong, Chinese Taipei, Singapore, of course, on top, and South Korea. So it's yes, your colleague is right. So the early access to schooling, and also the close relationship of what they are doing at home versus what they are doing at school gives them, you know, a proper foundational standpoint in schooling. So these are largely homogeneous populations. So again, they at home, the parent is reinforcing in the same language, exposing the learner to those activities, giving resources in the same language. So our context is a bit different. What we're finding is that the learning trajectory of the typical South African child is they go to ECD centers, and now that we've incorporated much more, regulations will come into place. But largely at the moment, it's taken in English. So there's a learner that starts their trajectory in English, then they come to primary school, into grade 1, they switch to home language. And then at grade 4, they switch back to English or Afrikaans. So this trajectory of learning is disrupted in terms of language proficiency, which will affect all content areas, mathematics, science, and other subjects as well.
Yeah, so what's the recommendation?
The recommendation, since we released the reading literacy results last year, we did a lot of work on how can we further strengthen mother tongue-based instruction and also mother tongue-based bilingual education. So how can we give our children longer time to gain the proficiency in language? So the proposal, and the department has done a lot of work in this regard, is to extend mother tongue instruction beyond the grade 3 into the intermediate and senior phases up to primary school. So giving children whose home language is Sesotho, is isiZulu, a better chance then of gaining the proficiency and sound understanding, and then, you know, they will be better placed to deal with the mathematics and the cognitive demand of subjects.
So what happens then to that switch once they go into high school?
In high school, they can continue with that language, or they can switch. So the idea is for learners at the end of primary school to be proficient in their mother tongue, as well as a first additional language, which in most cases is English. So by the end of primary school, and this is the case, Eldrin, in Germany, in France, where you're learning in your home language, but you are gaining proficiency in the other language, which it could be English. So at the end of primary school, the learners should have proficiency in both the home language and English.
Yeah, there was a pilot that the Department of Basic Education started, I think in the Eastern Cape, if I'm not mistaken, where some learners would start writing subjects in their mother tongue languages, or let's say medium of instruction, for instance. Are those results showing us that actually that learners perform much better if the language of the test is the same language that they speak at home?
It does confirm. So we did a rapid assessment study, and there were researchers that conducted further analysis on the Eastern Cape pilot, and it shows a clear difference that the Eastern Cape children, those that did have the mother tongue instruction continue into higher grades, are doing much better when you compare their school-based assessment results. Of course, the Eastern Cape has also got other contextual issues in terms of resources and so forth that also play a role.
Yeah, so can we see that being rolled out to other matric provinces?
That's the intention, and that's the longer-term goal. Well, I think, Eldrin, you've got to look at it from a systemic point. So these cohort of learners, like the Eastern Cape, they started in earlier grades. So that cohort of learners has to move through the different grades and phases and ultimately then write their national senior certificate in their home language.
Yeah. One of the other points that was raised a couple of years ago, there was a report by the Human Science Research Council that looked into the teacher's ability to teach. Does this report at all look into that particular factor, whether our teachers are well equipped to actually teach the type of workload that they need to teach, irrespective of the language that is being used, but the capacity of the teacher to actually teach that subject?
And that's an important point that has been investigated in these studies as well. So what we're finding from a qualifications perspective, our teachers are well qualified. So all our primary school children, whether it's in grade 3 or grade 6, are being taught by teachers that are qualified. So they've completed either a degree or a diploma that allows them to teach. And in the SACMEG study, which is the one study that teaches content knowledge, that assesses teachers' content knowledge, we're seeing high levels of content knowledge. So then the question is there a pedagogical issue between your content knowledge that you have and the mediation of it to learners? So there is a gap there, and we want to better support our teachers in terms of a pedagogical shift. And we want to work with higher education institutions who are training teachers on more modern pedagogies, on how to get closer to remediation and identification of learning gaps. So that's where there's a gap that comes through these studies.
Yeah. Is that the period spent in class at all a consideration as well?
The period spent in class is very important. So what the study shows that children or learners that were exposed to more teaching time, where teachers were always present and they were more present in school, so did better, significantly better than children that had less teaching time, that had less homework, less exposure, to the content that they need to receive.
So do all of these then inform our policy directive around how we're going to approach this going forward? Do we increase the number of hours that children spend in class? Do we even decide and look into whether we want to start the schooling hour a bit later on instead of starting at 7 or 8 a.m.?
Well, it may not be so much about the schooling hour. I mean, teachers have to be on time, on task, but it may be, like you were alluding to in the Eastern countries, starting the curriculum, and the conceptual understanding earlier than what we are doing at the moment. So bringing that into the school mix. And now that we have the ECD within the basic education sector, the curriculum framework and the content. Some of these ECD centers are just, play centers and play schools.
A daycare
centers. So we need to bring in stronger curriculum concepts earlier and, look at how that folds into primary school. So you want to have a balanced curriculum. STEM subjects are very important, science, maths, and technology, but also children must have a holistic development at schools. So their day in school must be, a balance of content, but also extracurricular emphasis on arts and music, and so that you have this more holistic development of the learner going.
Yeah, and I wonder whether all of these, if we have some of these interventions, especially if we're starting off with the ECD level, if we could see a change in the approach that is taken by government when it comes to whether the two streams, whether you go vocational, whether you go the academic route post your grade 9, if you could see some changes there as well, in terms of how many pupils actually want to still continue the academic route and how many would say, actually, let me do the vocational route.
Yes, and that's going to be very critical because that reflects more the skill set that our learners have. Not everyone is academically inclined. And certainly what we're seeing from industry and the demand of jobs is that you need that balance of vocational skills and your pure academic skills as well. So the department is doing a lot of work. We have a 3-stream model that has been piloted, and we have a general education certificate that has been piloted. Almost 3,000 schools participated this year amongst grade 9. The idea is to then empower these learners with knowledge and skills equipped for them to engage in further education pathways, either a vocational route or an occupational route or an academic route. So that will give them expanded opportunities to show their skills.
Dr. Chetty, thank you so much for your time. There is Dr. Mark Chetty, Director of National Assessment at the Department of Basic Education, on some of the reports that were released yesterday looking at international benchmarks as well and how our students are performing